Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. My name is Chris Simpson, Programs Lead at Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. We are so glad you are all here for another installment of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center's Book Talk. This virtual series focuses on recently published books related to our work on Holocaust education, defending human rights, and combating anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of hate. We are excited to have Keith Morgan on this evening's program, who will speak about his book, Ruta's Closet. For this session, please feel free to have your videos on, but with your mics muted so we don't have any accidental disruptions. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so for folks who are unable to join us today can watch it at a later date. You are more than welcome to submit your questions using the chat function throughout the program, and we will do our best to get to them at the end of the program. I am proud to be joined by my colleague, Robert Sarner, Senior Editor and Writer at the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center and host of Book Talk. On that note, I will hand it over to you, Robert.
Thanks so much, Chris, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight for this latest edition of FSWC's Book Talk series. I'm thrilled to have with us as our featured guest tonight, Keith Morgan, the award-winning author, former newspaper and radio journalist, who's joining us live from Vancouver, where he lives. We'll be discussing, as Chris mentioned, the poignant nonfiction book that Keith co-wrote called Ruta's Closet, of which a newly revised edition was just published. Later in the program, as Chris mentioned, we plan to take questions from the audience, so please do use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. As we begin our program, I just want to say that our thoughts are with the courageous people of Israel who are enduring another difficult night due to the ongoing missile attacks from Iran. We pray for a swift and total victory for Israel, and at the same time, for the immediate return of all hostages. Before beginning my conversation with Keith about Ruta's Closet, I'm going to read brief bios for both Keith and his co-author, the late Ruth Cron-Siegel, whose family Holocaust story is at the heart of the book. Keith is a highly accomplished writer and newspaper and radio journalist. He was born in Blackpool, England in 1954 and moved to Vancouver in 1980. He then spent the next 35 years in various editorial roles at the Vancouver Sun and the province newspapers. The first edition of Ruta's Closet was published in 2011, and in recent years, Keith has been active in expanding its impact by way of a new podcast series, an interactive website, speaking engagements, and further research for the new edition. Ruth Cron-Siegel, who is the Ruta in the book's title, was born in Lithuania in 1936. After surviving the Holocaust as a child, she moved with her family to Canada, eventually settling in Vancouver. In her later life, she dedicated much of her time to educating young people about the atrocity that her family and her endured in Lithuania during the Holocaust. She died in 2008, shortly after the completion of the first edition of Ruta's Closet. 2 months ago, the city of Vancouver proclaimed April 9th as Ruta Cron-Siegel Day in recognition of her work doing Holocaust education with young people. It's now my pleasure to welcome Keith Morgan to this evening's book talk. And thank you, Keith, for taking the time to be with us tonight. Keith, why don't we begin with you giving a brief description or overview of Ruta's Closet?
I set out to tell one family's story, a dramatic story, a family that I think people could relate to, 2 children, 2 young adults at the time, of course, and it went on to become a tale not just of their story, but also the greater story of the Shavel ghetto, what happened there to other people there, and probably to some extent to the much larger story of what happened in Lithuania.
Well, clearly, Keith, your journalistic talent and your eye for dramatic detail are both very much in evidence in the book. And for example, the way you start the book, which I thought was extremely effective, extremely engaging, um, you describe the attempt by Ruta's parents to escape with the family from Lithuania from the oncoming invasion by the Nazis. And they try to escape to neighboring Latvia. But in the middle of it, they decide, well, the father, Ruta's father, decides to abort the escape and return home. A question I have for you is about the title. How did you choose the title, and what is the significance of Ruta's Closet?
Well, as readers will learn later in the book, when Ruth is rescued, she's hidden in a closet quite often to avoid being found by Nazis coming around and knocking on the schoolhouse door looking for people, but also because Ruth did not speak about her Holocaust experience until, let's be kind of say, middle age. And she saw what happened, in Rwanda and the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, and she said, "I've got to tell my story." And so I described it as coming out of the closet to tell her story to young people, which is what she did for many years.
Now, the book was recently republished in its third edition. What is different about this current edition, the latest edition, from the two previous ones?
Well, subtle changes. I did actually rewrite one complete chapter and add a little bit more information about a mass killing. I also was able to update the numbers of children taken by the Nazis in a kinder action through some bit of mathematics and calculation based on some Nazi polling that was done in the ghetto, and a number of other lines here and there of people's names that I didn't have the first time around. So I was able to enhance the story, but I must say, of course, being the journalist, I can't stop myself, following up. And in fact, in the future of the podcast, we're going to find out some even newer material that I found. One particularly about a much hated Nazi I found about his end, which is referred to in the book, but I found out a lot more detail.
So Ruta's story, or Ruth's story, that has become so central in your life over the past 15 plus years, but how did you first become involved in the telling of this story?
My boss, Michael Cook, who was the editor of the Toronto Star after he left Vancouver, when he was in Vancouver, he came over to me and said, "I want you to do a new column about neighbors, people who make a difference to others. So go out and find me some." I'd been doing crime reporting for I don't know how many years. Why he picked me, I don't know. But anyway, through family connections, Ruth's name came up, and it intrigued me as one with two children. Growing up, I thought, need to hear that. And wouldn't you know, my teenage daughter at the time said, "Oh, Ruth, I've heard her at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. She's got a great story to tell." So I went along and was hooked. The journalist in me was just intrigued by the story, and I knew there was a lot more to it.
You once said in an interview that telling Ruth's story had become your mission in life. I think those are the very words you used. As someone who's not Jewish, why did you decide to devote so much of your time over these past 15 plus years to this project?
There are a number of reasons, but I think maybe I'll go back to the first stage when we decided we should do a book. I was introduced to Sir Martin Gilbert, the late Sir Martin, who you all know of, the most published author. I went to see him, and he looked me in the eye and he said, "This story, I'm familiar with it, needs telling. People don't know what happened in the Baltics, and they should know. It was particularly bad. They should know about it." And he looked at me and said, "And you should tell it like you write your crime stories." He said, "Make people relate to it. This is not just for Jews. Everybody should read this story." So I figured I'd been told what I had to do. And throughout, Ruth kept saying to me, "You are going to carry on telling my story, aren't you, when I'm done?" And by that, you know what she meant. And shortly before she died, she looked at me again and said the same thing. And I said, "Well, of course I am. There's a lot more to do yet." And by that time, my children were much older. And we were starting to see, after she'd gone, a lot, the start of that growth of anti-Semitism. And I realized there was a lot more to be done. And just going out and speaking to people and doing that kind of thing wasn't enough.
What do you hope readers will take away from the book? And related to that, do you feel the book is even more relevant today, given the dramatic upsurge in anti-Semitism that we witnessed over the past few years, especially since October 7th?
I believe that it's an inspiring story for anybody to read. I think that, especially people with children, you see what's going on now. I mean, it shows you what happens when somebody decides they're going to blame all Jews for everything perceived as being wrong with their nation or happening to them. It shows that very clearly. We've seen that recently. Again, we see it growing. We see even my own lawyer, for goodness sake, after October 7, I think he stayed at home for a while for fear of threats. We all know stories about that. So the new version was already, in the works, of course, pretty much complete. But that's when we decided, also with my producer, that we really had to do a 25-part podcast series, which really builds on Holocaust awareness and speaks to all generations. It speaks to older folks like me. But we think it's really important that we had features in there that related to youngsters. And in fact, the Holocaust Center I just mentioned, they produced a fabulous study guide for teachers. A Holocaust curriculum is compulsory in British Columbia. And Ruta is a recommended reading from the Holocaust Center. So the teachers have a guide to it. It's excellent. But they also did a guide for book clubs with challenging questions, challenging thoughts for people to think about. I want them to take the stories out and put themselves in that situation. I make no bones about some of the stuff is really hard reading. The mass killings that I covered, I really didn't hold back. I got amazing detail and I used it. And I thought, no, people really do have to see what happened. And it's undeniable. It happened. And so I want them to see that. I want them to think about that. I want them to relate to that's what's been happening in the last 10 years or more. And think about what they can do. It just stresses the importance of youngsters hearing stories like this and learning about this. You can't scapegoat one group of people for everything. And that's what's has happened again. Really worries me.
Keith, as part of the ongoing evolution of this project, with the various editions of the book, with the podcast series, with the interactive website, is part of that evolution trying to make it more pertinent to today and a new generation?
Yes, indeed. We're going to feature interviews with people around the world who are using creative, innovative ways of raising awareness. We're going to talk to teachers about what they're doing. We're going to cover that. We're going to cover some news events. We're going to have debates. We're going to bring people in. We've got some guys, some radio guys actually doing books that are relevant. But there's an emphasis on books for young people. We're going to feature those. We've got somebody talking about Holocaust movies. One of the innovations, I think, is when I did a series in the province newspaper called Hidden from the Holocaust, which was about Ruth, of course. We had sections in which we talked about what else was happening in the world at that time, that's specific to the actual chapters. So what we've done is I've twisted the arm of a couple of BBC friends of mine, and that we've created some newscasts from the time that relate to the time of those chapters, and they deliver it in the way that ghetto residents might have heard on illicit radios. So we fire people's imaginations. I'm hoping somebody will think that's a really good idea and maybe do some more. So we're trying to be really innovative in how we do it. Each pod starts off with me reading a chapter from the book, and we follow it through. And I do the backstory, because as you gather, there's a lot more to this book in the way I went about getting it. And there's some pretty remarkable tales. So I tell those stories as well, because that engages people. We want people to be creative in telling their stories.
Well, you're nothing if not a great storyteller. That's clear from the book. Just a reminder to everybody, in a short while, we're going to be taking questions from the audience for Keith. So please do submit your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. As we mentioned earlier, Ruth was born and grew up in her childhood in Lithuania, in a town by the name of Šavel, where before the Holocaust, a quarter of the 32,000 residents of the town were Jewish. Remarkable. 25% of the population was actually Jewish before the war began. What was Ruth's childhood like before the Nazis occupied the town in 1941?
Ruth told me that it was a life that you would want for any child. They wanted for nothing. Both parents had good jobs. Lovely town, lots to do, cultural centers. A wonderful place to grow up in, and she recalls those times. Big change when she went into the ghetto, of course.
Many of the non-Jewish residents of the town, or actually throughout Lithuania for that matter, actually welcomed the arrival of the Nazis, as you know, for having driven out the Russians who had occupied Lithuania since the beginning of World War II. For local Jews, how did life change once the Nazis took over the country?
Well, dramatically, immediately. The moment they crossed the border, the Lithuanian activist front, the fascists, were going around rounding up Jews and killing them, basically in the woods. They were arresting the leaders and imprisoning them. And then when they got enough numbers together, took them out and shot them. So everybody was in great danger all the time. And at one point, I guess what happened is the Nazis were in control and said, excuse me, if we're going to be killing Jews, we'll supervise it. And so the deaths carried on. Anybody that was of no use to the war effort for the Nazis, basically that was it. Others were sent to camps, work camps. Others, the family were employed. Hesitate to use the word employed, but they were in the leather factory. And this was the part of the smart attitude of the Crones, the parents. They figured out that as long as they had positions within the leather factory and they were providing those boots for those Nazi boys on the Eastern Front, they would live another day. And they did that. But of course, I would say devious in the right way. Meyer, Crone, managed to rescue a lot of other Jews who had no skills whatsoever.
I should just mention, excuse me for interrupting,
Yeah,
Meyer was the father.
yeah, father, sorry. And he brought people in with no skills. People who would claim to be electricians, but probably had about the same skill as me. They could change a light bulb, and that was it. They were brought in because they could be hidden. If the Nazis came around in the factory, they could be moved to another thing and turn something on. So there were dozens that he brought in, way more than was needed to do what had to be done. So that was, you might say, that was his Schindler's moment. But and I mean, those are the things that really intrigue me. The role that this family played in the greater ghetto. Other members of the family were influential. They'd get to hear what was going on. They knew what was being discussed at the Judenrat, which was the Jewish council. They did some very, very daring things, getting people out of the ghetto, smuggling kids out. They were a part of that. And those tales are inspirational. What you mentioned, neighbors. People went out to get food. They would sneak out of the ghetto. A lot of their neighbors already turned on them. Wouldn't give them jewelry that they were holding for them. And you mentioned earlier about them welcoming the Nazis in. Yeah, because many of them had a bad time under the Russians, and many of them accused Jews of being communists, of course. And so what was also striking here, if I might jump ahead a little, when I was doing some of the work, I was talking to Martin Gilbert about that. And he said, he'd just been to Lithuania himself. And he said, this was, I guess, early 2000s. And he said, I'm just in Lithuania. And he said, you don't have to scratch very far beneath the surface to see the same attitude, which of course is what you referred to earlier about the ongoing debate there. The collaboration was stunning. I mean, going out on mass murders and then going back to the parish hall after, where they'd be greeted by the parish priest and have a vodka session. Really? Yes. Fortunately, I also was exposed to the righteous priests who were running underground lines to get to rescue people. But that struck me so hard, so hard.
Just coming back to the book, Keith, what was the biggest challenge for you in writing the book, in the researching of it? How much research actually did it entail?
A great deal. I went back to Lithuania twice. I went once, of course, with Ruth. She toured me around the ghetto, which at that time was still pretty much there, to a house that she and 12 other people shared in the ghetto, a little tiny one. I'll just call it a cabin. That was tough. But what was very interesting, that was around 2000. I'd gone into my boss, Cook, again and said, hey, I can go back and meet one of the people that rescued her. And he said, why haven't you booked the ticket? And so off I went. And when we got there, I was introduced to Ona Rogauskis, who was one of the rescuers. And she was very reticent at how much she would tell me. And the translator told me after, she said, problem here is the Russians haven't been gone very long. And they fear they're coming back. Now, does that sound familiar at the moment with Latvia and Lithuania? And so she was careful about what she said. But one of the other reasons that stunned me, it wasn't just that. It was that she had neighbors still alive who had no idea what they had done in rescuing Jews. And she was frightened of them taking it out on her once it was known. But when I went back a second time, a few years later, the Lithuanians had their own country for some time without the Russians. They were in charge. and she spoke much more freely. And that was the same with everybody else I interviewed in Lithuania then. They started to open up. When I started to talk to officialdom, I came across just what you were talking about earlier, people who just didn't want to accept it, didn't believe it happened, and dismissed it. And due to this day, I'm still encountering people who are fighting over getting property back and fighting over recognition for what happened. I think one of the classics for me was that Dr. Wurf Pesapovich, who was the second cousin of Ruth, the doctor, the head of the ghetto medical area, he hid, before the Nazis landed, he hid all of his jewelry and all manner of things before they came in, with the intentions of getting it back later. Well, he went back long after the war, and they'd built a crossroads right over it. So probably somebody had profited, but not him. But that was happening all over. People hiding stuff, people giving stuff for safekeeping and then never getting it back. And as Ruth told me, mother going out to see friends and said, "Don't you ever come back here again. I don't want to see you again." That was the nicest, kind of reunion. But others were threatening. You come here again with Gestapo, we'll find out.
Well, quite sobering.
Yeah.
So speaking to this trip back to Lithuania when you accompanied Ruth, we just showed a photograph a few moments ago. I'm not sure if you saw it on the screen. I take it that was Ruth, and was that Ona? Maybe you can show the picture again.
Yeah.
And Ona was one of the righteous Gentiles that helped save.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Perhaps you could speak a little bit, Keith, to this photograph.
Well, as you can see, she'd aged, and she was in pretty good spirits then, and she'd lost her husband some years ago, and both.
Is that Ona on the right when you were looking at the screen?
Yeah, Ona with the white hair. Yes.
Right. And was that the first time? Excuse me for interrupting. I just want to ask you though: was it the first time that Ruth was reunited?
No, she'd gone back earlier because Yad Vashem had recognized Ona and Tanis, her husband, for rescuing Ruth and others, and so she took the award. In fact, there's some really good video which we will put up on the YouTube site when we get that going, showing about that earlier visit. And Ruth telling her story live, as it were, in Lithuania.
What was it like for you, Keith, to witness this form of reunion, to see Ruth reconnect in person with a woman who, thanks to, in part to her, that Ruth had survived? What was that? Even though it may not have been the first time that Ruth saw Ona, still it must have been pretty emotional. And what was it like for you?
It wasn't. You didn't see the hard-edged crime reporter at the scene with me. The lump in the throat soon came, and I cried.
Literally, you were brought to tears.
As happens occasionally now.
Just imagine. I can just imagine the scene. You evoked already a little bit the Holocaust in Lithuania, where many of our viewers may be familiar, maybe some are not, because it's quite staggering when you see the numbers that during the Holocaust, the Nazis and their willing collaborators murdered more than 200,000 Jews. And what's really remarkable is that represents 96% of the Jewish population of Lithuania before the war. And I know that, and you referred a little bit to this, the fact that to this day in Lithuania, there are people who either minimize or even deny the Jewish suffering during the Holocaust and refuse to acknowledge the Lithuanian complicity in the mass murder of the country's Jewish population. So my question is, given that backdrop, how have people responded to your book in Lithuania? I don't know if it's been translated yet, but presumably when you were there researching for the book, and perhaps some people have read the book, how has it been received? And how have you been received?
You might say a mixed reception. I don't know how much it's been read there. I know some people were passing it around, but there's no translation, unfortunately, yet. But I also heard positive stuff from people who are there now and doing work to educate their own people and to dig up what really happened. How many images that sticks with you, and the pictures in the book, is these mass murder sites. They're all over the place. They're outside small towns. How can you deny it happened? They are. You go outside the picturesque town or village. Oh, what's that? Oh, it's the site of a mass murder. Some now have stones on them, which I think a lot of American Jews who survived and came away from Lithuania have funded, gravestones, etc., and markers. But it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So it's really difficult to understand how people just can't accept it. There you go. There's a picture of one of them. That's it. Can you see? Look how flat that is. Dug up, bodies thrown in, covered, nothing else. That's it.
Wow.
Just unbelievable. Some miraculously were shot, but managed to get out of those graves. Others were getting out and then were re-shot. But that's everywhere. There's lots of reminders if you choose to believe it.
What sets Lithuania apart? Perhaps, well, I've already mentioned the 96% of the extermination of its Jewish population.
Well,
what else sets it apart in terms of the Holocaust that was different in Lithuania from other countries occupied by the Nazis?
It's because the way the Nazis did it. First of all, you had the fascist front there who were quite happy to go about doing their own killing. You had that. You also had the Einsatzkommando, who were basically just executioners, groups that would come in. They would follow the invasion. They'd come in behind and clean up the Jewish problem. And so they would go from town to town, gather everybody up that was of no use, take them into the woods and shoot them. And locals would assist and dig the grave, the long graves, and as I said, go away and celebrate after. So that's how they did it, and they were very, very efficient. What the Nazis did in each ghetto within days, I suppose they carried out a census. So they had the name of every person, where they came from, what their age was, what their profession was. That's when the lying came in. Oh, I'm an electrician. I'm a plumber. And they had this incredible, they were great, they were amazing bookkeepers, and they kept everything. Shavel, their ghetto census was actually published a few years ago. I have it, and the detail is incredible. So they had lots to work with. They knew who was there. They knew who was useful to them. And they knew who wasn't in use. Not everybody was shot, obviously. Many ended up, those that went to camps, labor camps around the area, they eventually, when the ghettos closed, some were shipped to Auschwitz, some went to a myriad different concentration camps and died there. And as we know, some were liberated, thank goodness. But it was very systematic in Lithuania. Very systematic.
Why do you think that Ruta's Closet has really taken on a life of its own?
Well, partly because I've been encouraged by good friends. I've been encouraged by the Holocaust Center here to carry on doing this. They've been very supportive. They've been very helpful. And, I mentioned Sir Martin earlier. Um, he mentored me, all the way through the process. And I remember the day that I finished writing it, and I appeared at his London home, as I'd done a number of times, and very sheepishly, like the British schoolboy I was, looking at a knight of the realm. I said to him, "So, yeah, well, the story as pretty much as well as I do, Martin, don't you?" And he said, "Yes, in fact, it's featured. Part of the story is featured in The Righteous, the book I wrote." And I refer, of course, to your book coming out. And he said, "So what do you want me to do for you today?" And I said, "Well, would you consider writing the foreword for me?" He said, "Of course, you'll have it within the week." Sadly, Martin died, as you know. But Lady Esther Gilbert took on the mantle. She's there for me right now. I think she's watching this. She helped proofread the last edition. And she told me the other day that she's reading it for the third time, and it's really hard. And she's been so helpful. She came along to Ruth Crone Siegel Day, and she spoke in City Hall, and she came back to the center actually after, and spoke again later about the relevance and how important this is, especially in the light of the growth of anti-Semitism. So I've been encouraged to keep going. And, I've had my moments, but I've thought, no, I've got to keep going. And, my podcast producer who did the audio book, which is out soon, took on the mission too. Because what happens with this story is when you get into it, you want to know more. I remember going to him one week, and we recorded the 3 chapters of the Kinder action where the children were taken to Auschwitz. And at the weekend, on the Friday, when I was coming back, he lives in Kelowna, when I was coming back to Vancouver, he said, I don't think I'm going to be able to do any editing this weekend. And I said, well, take a break. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, I've been listening to you telling this story, these 3 chapters, and I can't do any more. You brought it to life. And I need to take a couple of days break. One of the BBC guys I mentioned earlier, TV producer, said, you know what? It's one of those books you can't put down until you have to. Because it is hard. It's hard. It's a hard read. But it's so important. We see it raw. And I guess that's what I brought to it with my background. I wrote it like fiction. And by the end of the book, you wish it were.
How has the whole experience impacted you, Keith? Has it changed you at all since you became involved in telling the story?
Yes, I'm sure some friends would say a lot more, but yes, it has. It's made me a lot more sensitive to what's happening around. I look at my granddaughter Emerson, who's nearly 5. She'll tell you, and I think, oh my goodness, what is the world that she's going to be growing up in? My 11-year-old grandson Francis, who is out there and is looking at what's going on. You know what? Because I've had such an impression with this story on the likes of my daughter Rachel. You know what's going to happen with those 2 kids. They're going to know about the Holocaust. They're going to learn the lessons. And even when they get to the stage in school, grade 10, grade 11, when they do it as a subject, they'll be able to speak to their class about it. That, for me personally, is very, very important. But I've also met a lot of survivors now, and they've told me their stories, and they will feature in the podcast because they're dying, and their stories need to be out there. It's changed me in that way. It's made me committed more to doing more, and there is a lot more. As my producer says to me, Morgan, you come up with a different idea every week. Well, I always used to do that in newspapers too, but you know, I've got some ideas as to expand this using new technology, using, you know, the glasses that have video. I want to visit the concentration camps and give that view, that point of view, because I think it's chilling and it's something you can put on TikTok. Because guess what? That's what people want, the young people especially. So I'm going to be gearing things towards them. They must know about this.
I'm glad you're continuing and making it so relevant and adapting it to the times in terms of how it's delivered to people. I'm going to turn now to a question from our audience. I see we have a question from David Stambler, and I'll read it to you. With your book being part of the official curriculum that the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center is recommending and supporting, you must have an insider's view of the Holocaust education landscape. What are your suggestions and ideas for how Holocaust education needs to improve in Canada?
Oh, just to clarify first, it's a recommended book by the Holocaust Center. It's not actually part of the curriculum. I think it might be used by a lot of people locally. I think, well, it is. I mean, I think Holocaust curriculum has spread pretty well across Canada, and there's a lot of places in North America. It's not compulsory in a lot of places. I believe it should be. So, you know, I must applaud the provincial government here for making this happen. I think what we have to do is what I've just been talking about there. We have to get really creative in how we tell these stories. We're not going to have survivors to give personal stories like Ruth. At some point, I'm going to pop off too. So I'm not going to be able to be out there talking to them. I can get through to kids. I'm a storyteller, you know that. But we need to find new and inventive ways. I mean, we're thinking about creating some grade 8 versions of Ruta using AI. We're challenging. We want to challenge youngsters to do video stuff, to use their imaginations, speak to them in the language that they speak, which I don't. So I think we need to lobby across Canada. We need to lobby to have this done. There are many sympathetic teachers. There are many that want to do this. There are many that already do. We need to talk to them. We need to bring them together. I know that the Holocaust Center here does that, brings teachers together, rewards them for the best, gives them awards, looks after them, makes sure they have the latest, greatest information. There's a lot of changes happening in education, Holocaust education, even different from when I started doing the book those years ago. You know, they're adapting and adopting, and we just have to keep doing that. This is a story for eternity. We can't afford to make these mistakes again.
Well, thank you, Keith. That brings us to the conclusion of this installment of FSWC's Book Talk. I want to thank everyone for joining us, with a special appreciation to Keith for being our featured guest. I'd also like to mention, before concluding, that immediately after our program, Keith has to scamper away because he's about to be honored in Vancouver, I believe at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. In fact, maybe just briefly, Keith, you can mention what this honor is about. And first of all, congratulations on receiving this honor.
Well, it's called, my good friend there, one of the board members, tells me it's a life fellow. So I'm assuming that's for the contributions I've made and the mission I've taken on here. So obviously I'm looking forward to that. Probably going to pass on supper to get there, but that's fine. Can I just mention quickly just a couple of things that I think are important?
Please.
You know, you mentioned earlier the website, Ruta, it's rutascloset.com. It's up. There's new material on there. We're adding stuff every day. There's news going up. The audio book's going to be out shortly, we hope. It's finished, but it's not gone up yet. That will be available. But I don't think, I can't remember if we mentioned, oh yeah, we did, the Holocaust Center's created a book club guide. You can download the book club guide and the study guide for teachers from that site. As of tomorrow, if my web designer son gets that bit up there overnight. But yeah, so please go to there and watch the Facebook page as well and watch what we're doing, because we're going to add lots over the next few months.
And I'll also add that Ruta's Closet is available at all good bookstores across Canada, and also available online for anyone who wants to purchase the book. And I do recommend
it's available worldwide now for the first time, everywhere.
Well, again, thank you so much, Keith, for being with us this evening, and congratulations on the honor you're about to receive. And we thank, of course, our audience again for being with us. We hope you'll be able to join us for the next installment of Book Talk, which will be coming up in the next month or two. And if you have any suggestions for future installments of Book Talk, please do let us know. We always welcome your feedback and suggestions, and any ideas you may have for future installments. So now, on behalf of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center, again, thank you again for being with us, and have a good night. Thank you.